Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's conversation, Structures of Consumption, the third event of Cooper Union Climate Week 2021. My name is Simon Garb, and I'm a student of the School of Art here at Cooper Union, a member of Cooper's Climate Coalition, and one of the curators of this year's event series. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our guests today, Nandita Sharma, Gaye Chan, and our moderator, Radhika Subramaniam. Radhika Subramaniam is an associate professor of visual culture at Parsons School of Design in the New School. She is a curator and writer with an interdisciplinary practice that uses exhibitions and texts as conscious forms of knowledge making. Gaye Chan is a conceptual artist who moves between solo and collaborative activities that take place on the web, in publications, streets, as well as galleries. Her recent work often ruminates on how cartography and photography simultaneously offer and include information. Past exhibition venues include Art in General in New York City, Articule in Montreal, Art Speak in Vancouver, Asia Society in New York City, Gallery 4A in Sydney, the Honolulu Museum of Art, SF Camera Work in San Francisco, Southern Exposure in San Francisco, and YYZ Artist Outlet in Toronto. Chan's collaborative projects include being a part of Eating in Public and Downwind Productions. Eating in Public is an anti-capitalism project nudging a little space outside of the commodity system. Following the path of pirates and nomads, hunters and gatherers, diggers and levelers, they gather at people's homes, plant free food gardens on private and public land, set up free stores, all without permission. Downwind examines the impact of colonialism, capitalism, and tourism. Through agitprop commodities and web media, Downwind takes up Waikiki as an actual specific site and site as a metaphor for countless other places where self-sustaining peoples have been dislocated for profit. Gaye Chan was born in Hong Kong and immigrated to the United States in 1969. She received her MFA from San Francisco Art Institute and is a professor of the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. Chan's work has been supported by Art Matters and the Creative Capital Foundation. Nandita Sharma is an activist scholar whose research is shaped by the social movements she is active in, including No Borders movements and those struggling for the planetary commons. She's the author of Home Economics, Nationalism in the Making of Migrant Workers in Canada, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2006, and Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants, published by Duke University Press in 2020. Sharma is a professor of the Sociology Department at the New School at Hawaii and Manoa. She received her PhD in sociology at the University of Toronto. And lastly, I'd like to acknowledge another curator and scheduled speaker for today's event, Sria Chatterjee. Sria Chatterjee received her doctorate in November of 2019 and was awarded the Charlotte Elizabeth Proctor Honorific Fellowship. She is currently an advanced researcher at the Institutes for Experimental Design and Media Cultures at FHNW Basel, an associate scholar at the Max Planck Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence. She is a contributing editor at British Art Studies. Shrives specializes in the political ecologies of art and design from the colonial to the contemporary in South Asia and other formerly colonized regions. Sria is currently completing her first book, which provides a close look at the deep links between nationalism, agriculture, and the natural environment through the history of art, design, and media. Her second book project considers the relationships between the arts, climate, health, and colonialism. She is the founder and project lead of the Visualizing the Virus digital project, which has won several grants and awards. Shria's research has been generously supported by the Yale Center for British Art, the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence, Max Planck Institute, the Paul Mellon Center for British Art, the Rockefeller Archive Center, and the Princeton Institute for International Regional Studies. She was the Frank J. Mather Fellow at Princeton in 2012. Unfortunately, Sria could not be with us today as she isn't feeling well. We're thinking of her, thanking her for being the inspiration for today's conversation, and wish her a speedy recovery. I would like to just point out that the point of reference for today's conversation comes from a piece she did for the British Art Studies entitled The Arts, Environmental Justice, and the Ecological Crisis, which you can find on the British Art Studies website. Now, without further ado, I'll stop talking, and I'd like to hand it over to our moderator, Professor Radhika Subramaniam.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you to the entire Cooper Climate Coalition for this invitation to be part of this conversation. And really kudos and congratulations to you on a really formidable and interesting program that you put together all week. As someone who thinks quite a bit about walking in particular, I was very happy to see the Peekskill hike as one of the items on your program. Unfortunately, can't join you for it, but it's really wonderful to see an interest in that. I'm also really happy to be in conversation with Nandita Sharma and Gaye Chan, two thinkers, practitioners with whom I have been intermittently in conversation for quite a while. And it's nice, therefore, to be in a more direct and active engagement at this point. I'm really sorry Sria couldn't join us, as her work has been very inspirational too. I think one of the things, before I turn it over to Gaye, one of the things I found particularly interesting in bringing Nandita and Gaye's work into conversation with questions of climate, as Cooper is doing here, is because of the ways in which they dig up, no pun intended, kind of prior histories as well as contemporary practices and bring them together in a manner that can allow us to visualize kind of other ways of being in the present. And it seems to me that at this point, when we are so panicked about a future, this capacity to disinter the present is actually something I find very powerful in their analysis as well as in their practice. I won't say much more right now because I think it would be very helpful for everyone to hear from Gaye and Nandita. So what we'll do is have Gaye speak and then Nandita follow, and then we will have a conversation, the three of us, before we open it up to get questions from the audience, and I'll feed that to them. So I'll turn it over to Gaye. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Again, I wanted to thank all the people that have made this possible, Simon, Miranda, and Shria. I hope you feel better very soon. Let me set my timer so I don't overrun. So as Simon mentioned, Nandita and I have been working on eating in public since 2003. You could call it a project, you can call it a group. I think it's always still constantly in formation. Eating in public started by accident, and it's a project that implements systems, autonomous, anarchist systems of exchange. We basically set up different kinds of sites, platforms in public and private spaces, mostly without permission, sometimes by invitation, that allows people to exchange goods, services, knowledge without any kind of supervision or monitoring from capitalism or the state, or in fact, not even us. And the systems continue to work only if the people who use them keep them going. For today, I want to start with just a couple of photographs of where we live so you can see the climate. The rooster there is sitting at the corner of our house. You see an avocado tree on the right by the rooster's head. I suppose it's a papaya tree. It's very lush. And whoops, here's our neighbor, Alden, who's drying aku, which is a large fish, on his roof. A vacant lot, 3 doors down from our house, where a tree trimmer would dump his wood chips on now and then, that I go and forage for our garden. Right around me, there are at least 7 or 8 edible weeds. So it's a climate and an environment where you can get food quite easily. In spite of that, like the rest of the United States, most of everything that we need to survive come from elsewhere, where some say that we're the most isolated, quote unquote, isolated place in the entire world. We're in the middle of the Pacific. 90% of our goods come from elsewhere. Regardless, people consume and discard like there's no tomorrow. This is not an unusual day on garbage day, which happens twice a week in our neighborhood. In spite of all the edible foods around, people have this idea of what it look like. and what belongs and what don't belong. Here's a common plantain, also called laukahi in Hawaiian, which was sprayed by herbicide. The third factor I want to mention is a more recent insidious rhetoric about invasive species. Another notion of what belongs and what must be eradicated. Space that needs to be defended from outside forces is often talked about in terms of biodiversity and infringement of plants and other species that threaten native wildlife. But very easily, willy-nilly, it jumps to other kinds of metaphorical usage about anything that are from elsewhere. These three drawings that I'm showing are the Hawaii government, some kind of program for children to get them to understand invasive species. So you see along there, these rats who are bringing, I don't know what that pile of stuff is that they're bringing, and then the native bird on the branch is dying off. I'll just let you contemplate this particularly scary xenophobic image here. The camera, I think, it signals tourism. So to return to all the food that's right around us, I became very interested in engaging in this or against this rhetoric of invasive species. None of these plants that I show here are native. However, it could really contribute to this fear of food security that's always in discussion in Hawaii. I started doing projects about edible weeds about 15 years ago. This one features 3 edible weeds that are found in Hawaii and many, many places around the world, if not all. I created a crate that unfolds into an edible weed seed distribution station. And so it could be packed up and moved from location to location. The station shows you what the weeds look like, how to harvest, where to find them, and seed packets from recycled envelopes, paper, upcycled paper from wherever I'm showing the project, where rubber stamps are available for you to stamp recipes on how to cook the seeds. Another project to reskill us and to give us the knowledge that many of us had before of how to use these weeds. We also started doing pop-up weed cooking and tasting events, sometimes announced as part of other events and sometimes just as a surprise when we find a lot of weeds. The plates that we use are always from plant matter, like these are banana tree stalks. We show up in farmers markets, senior centers, summer camp, and always with our recipes in tow. Our recipes are also found online and also cooking videos on Vimeo and YouTube. We've been doing free stores since 2003, but since COVID, we've also utilized them and focused on plant sharing, plant and seed sharing. It's grown to 10 or 12 on the island of Oahu where we live. And along with some of these free plant stores, we've also implemented edible weed displays. So it's a permanent physical manifestation of showing people what weeds look like. It's a bit of a joke because the weeds have just been moved right outside of the planter into the planter. So a typical kind of art strategy where it's just really about framing. So my purpose is simple. It's just for people to recognize the food source that's all around them. None of them native. Oh, I guess, I'm not even sure if Laukahi is native. Here's Nandita harvesting. And just so that when we look around us, we deal with what's actually there instead of abstract ideas of belonging and strategies of survival. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation. Sorry, my cursor has now disappeared. Simon, can you recapture my screen?
Okay. Great. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. This is the interesting thing about switching everything over to Zoom. We just have much bigger audiences, so this is fantastic. So first of all, thank you very much to the organizers of this talk, especially Simon Garb, Elisa Petrosova, Amanda Simpson, Miranda Mallenbaum, and everyone else whose labor has made this possible. I really appreciate it. My talk today is largely based on my 2020 book, Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants. And I just want to start by saying that we live in a world whose political organization in no way corresponds with the way we actually live our lives. This is true ecologically. It may be a cliche, but it is plainly evident that the Earth's atmosphere is not divided by national boundaries. Despite the proliferation of national borders, greenhouse gases cause the same degree of global warming no matter where they are produced. Our economies, and therefore our social connections, encompass the world, as is evident in this event. While we cannot live without one another's labor, one another's sociability, and without all of the other beings without whom our lives would come to a swift end, we have a political system of nation states that politically divides us from each other on the basis of nationality. We have nation states who claim land and air and water as their sovereign territory, who claim people, other animals, and plants as theirs, who claim to have the exclusive power to determine who enters their national space and under what conditions. As Benedict Anderson pointed out, the national organization of society is one in which the political community is always imagined as a limited community. Because no nation encompasses all the world's people, nor does any nation want to, immigration and citizenship controls become crucial technologies for nation making and nation maintaining. They are also key technologies for implementing a global apartheid, which, like the South African apartheid of the mid to late 20th century, a global apartheid is based on differentiated nationality. I've been working for a long time specifically about the political, economic, and social consequences of nation states' control over human mobility. I've traced the shifts in how states have governed people's mobility as the form of state power has shifted from an imperial form to a national form. This process of nationalizing state sovereignty began fitfully in the 19th century in the Americas. And by the 1960s, the national form of state sovereignty had become the dominant form worldwide. It is at this point that we can say that a new global order emerged, one that I call the post-colonial New World Order. In this new system of governance, people across the world are defined as part of separated nations and ruled through the combined apparatuses of nation-state sovereignty, international bodies like the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and global capital. Established after the end of World War II, post-colonialism marks the end of the political legitimacy of imperial state sovereignty and the beginning of the hegemony of national forms of state sovereignty. Please don't confuse post-colonialism with decolonization, because it is far from that. After World War II, with astonishing speed, the near global space of imperialism was mostly nationalized. Between 1945 and 1960 alone, 36 new nation states in Asia and Africa were granted either a restricted autonomy or outright independence from empires. In the 1960s, the two most powerful imperial states entering World War II, the British and the French, lost much of their empires and nationalized their sovereignty, the sovereignty of their imperial metropoles by imposing new immigration laws directed against their former colonial subjects. For those people who did not obtain a national sovereignty of their own, the demand for it nevertheless defines their struggles. For many who have been identified as Armenians or Kurds, Mohawks or Hawaiians, Palestinians, Kashmiris, or Tamils, their struggles are framed as struggles for national liberation. It is thus clear that in the post-colonial New World Order, being a member of a nation in possession of territorial sovereignty is the thing to be or to become. Only by organizing as a nation can claims to power in this system be heard. This is not an accident. In its 1945 founding charter, the United Nations enshrined the recognition of the right of national self-determination, or the right to national sovereignty for those people who could successfully claim to be the people of a place, as the bedrock of international law. Hostility to migrants was firmly established in this charter. With its declaration that the rights of nations to self-determination, it would not, nor could it, account for the rights of all those people who were not the people of the nation, i.e., those who were people out of place. The UN Charter stood in stark contrast to how many people actually lived, and certainly in stark contrast to the reality of the immediate post-World War II experience of mass migration. This anonymous proverb perhaps best captures the ethos of post-colonialism. When the axe came into the woods, many of the trees said, "At least the handle is one of us." While post-colonialism clearly does not work for most of the world's people, the largely melancholic response to the grossly unequal social relations of post-colonialism sustains it. Again, as Benedict Anderson pointed out, nationness is the most universally legitimate value in the political life of our time. The current international regime of nation states, with its ever-intensifying immigration controls, is not designed to allow for a reasonable and a just response to the need of people to move as a result of climate catastrophe. Indeed, it is designed to compound the misery. So even though a United Nations Environmental Program report coined the term environmental refugees in 1985 and defined the term as, quote, people who have been forced to leave their traditional habitat temporarily or permanently because of a marked environmental disruption, natural and or triggered by people, that jeopardized their existence and or seriously affected the quality of their life, unquote, nothing has yet been done to ensure that the current refugee regime incorporates climate change as a grounds for claiming refugee status. People fleeing climate change have no right to cross international borders in search of new homes. Even within the territories of nation states, growing xenophobia against even co-citizens on the move is intensifying, often in the name of favoring locals who are seen as more indigenous to the areas to the area than others from other parts of the same nation state. So even though people moving because of climate catastrophe may colloquially be referred to as refugees, there simply is no place for environmental refugees, or the later term climate refugees, within the post-World War II international mobility regime. The definition of refugee established by the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and the subsequent 1967 protocol outline the rights of the displaced as well as the legal obligation of states to protect them. The definition of who nation states will recognize as a refugee is very narrow and increasingly so. In international law, refugee is the state category granted to those people that nation states determine to have a well-founded and documented fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So while the regime of refugee protection may be international, it is up to each nation state to establish mechanisms that allow them to grant asylum or deny it. Since the establishment of the current refugee regime after 1951, nation states have increasingly limited the number of people they will accept as refugees. This varies, and again, the rich world sorely lags behind the poor world in providing asylum. The UN High Commission for Refugees estimates that in 2020, there were about 82.4 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. Of that number, the vast majority are not considered to be refugees. The 4 nation states with the most number of refugees are Turkey with 3.7 million, Jordan 2.9 million, Lebanon 1.4 million, and Pakistan 1.4 million. In contrast, the rich world notably accepts very few refugees and is doing the most it can to further restrict access to its territories. In fiscal year 2020, just over 11,800 individuals arrived in the United States as refugees, the fewest since the establishment of the refugee admissions program. And this represented a 61% decrease from the 30,000 refugees admitted in 2019. President Biden says that he intends to increase to 125,000 the number of refugees who can enter the United States in the fiscal year beginning October 1st of this year. Yet, this is what is currently taking place at the US's southern border as the Border Patrol in Texas attacks migrants from Haiti. Nation states, especially in the rich world, have been trying to reduce the number of refugees in particular because under international law, refugees and refugees alone have the right to enter nation states in order to claim asylum. For example, and despite both the rhetoric and the actions of the US government under both Trump and Biden, it is not illegal to enter the United States, even without official permission, with no documents, and with the assistance of smugglers or traffickers, as states increasingly like to term anyone who actually helps people to cross national borders. Again, asylum seekers have a right to cross national borders that no other person who is not a citizen has. And again, all other people on the move, people moving because they've lost their livelihoods, because they live in poverty, because they experience the kind of violence that's not defined under refugee law as persecution, people fleeing floods, droughts, etc., do not have such a right. Because of the unique set of rights carried by asylum seekers, nation states have been busy doing 2 things: trying to divert asylum seekers from claiming refugee status in their nation state by diverting them to other nation states, i.e. what the Texas Border Patrol here is doing, forcing Haitian migrants back into Mexico. And secondly, trying to narrow the definition of refugee so that fewer and fewer people can gain asylum. Let me just move forward. I would just like us to ask the question, are people fleeing the war unleashed by Bashar al-Assad in Syria refugees fleeing persecution by the state? Are they climate refugees fleeing the drought that is raging across Syria and has been for the past decade? Or are they economic migrants seeking new livelihoods? They are all 3 of these and more. I'm part of a global movement for no borders and have been for the past 20 years. This movement is building. The demand for people's freedom to move is an important and necessary part of any effort to respond to the climate catastrophe. Anything else is death. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nandita and Gaye. Gaye, are you back with us? Yes. There's a very different, provocative, but intersecting presentations. And so maybe I'll just start by trying to think of a couple of questions that connect these the two ways in which you approach what I see as the common ground of questioning notions of belonging, questioning notions of territory. And that is actually by trying to get us to think of how these debates, the ways in which you've outlined it, Nandita, as the kind of the legitimation of the nation state as the only form of, as a handmaiden to racial capitalism and as the only form in which one can conceive of a liberatory politics. And the ways in which you, Gaye, are thinking about it in a sense in an on-the-ground approach of overturning the systems by which we relate to each other. And both of them, it seemed to me in some way, to allow us to think of the problems or the issues that arise when climate forces us and demands of us that we think of ourselves as existing in a more than human world, right? So some of these questions, are undertaken because in a sense the floods, the fires, and so on remind us that there is a world beyond us over which we have no control. And then the other species that move alongside with and across our own movement remind us as well that we exist alongside each other. So I want to ask a question which I hope both of you will answer possibly slightly differently. And I want to take on the one hand, Gaye, your notion of the weed, or that you're working with the weed as something that is out of place, not quite in its proper place. Also perhaps something that is sometimes considered opportunistic, and sometimes an invader, not always an invader. So weeds are not always invasive, but they come in and they sort of exist in this, in a way that somehow is not appropriate to the ecology or ecosystem of the place. And you, Nandita, are talking about the refugee as someone who is a character who is strange, someone to be afraid of, but also curiously abject. So the weed on the one hand is this, opportunistic, feisty creature. The refugee can be that, but the refugee is a mixture of being feisty, opportunistic, invasive, but also strangely abject. In both instances, it seems to me like I'm trying to think of like, how does one construct a response, a political response to this, to the existence of these categories that come to us as sort of felt through a system of feeling, right? Of something that people who inhabit an area feel in response to that. And Gaye, I want to ask you a little bit, like, is it possible to think of a practice around weeds that does not turn the weeds into, again, functional items? That is one of the things I guess I'm thinking about is the matter out of place, like is another way of putting them back in place in a sense to restore use value to them. So that would be one question I have about you. Right. Like, is there a way to conceive of politics that is useless, that allows for useless? And for you, Nandita, maybe one way I would think about this is often the separation of a politics around migration or no borders, or that concentrates on people while separating the other group of people who are also interested in no borders and so on, but are classified under environmental issues, who may be concerned with corridors or flyways or other ways in which one needs to move across borders. And these are often pitted as in opposition to each other. So I hope both of those questions, which I think come from a common place, but maybe you would want to answer them slightly differently. So whoever would like to go first.
Yeah. So I'll go first. Thank you, Radhika. There was a lot packed in there. So pointed out if I've overlooked portions of it. So I belong to a very active Facebook group that's based in Hawaii of gardeners. And one of the most common posts is this a weed? And then asking other members to help them identify. And then, so I think first people think that weed is a static something, when it's really only about what is desirable and what belongs. There's no other. And I think that what defines a weed is really the gardener. And it's usually their aesthetics or their politics. I don't really know what else there is. And I think that your most important question is that I think the flaw of a lot of methods of mitigation is that it's still very kind of anthrocentric. Is that right?
Anthropocentric.
Anthropocentric. Thank you. That we can't, through our imagination, can't kind of move beyond our humanness. So we grow plants. Do we grow plants for their use value to humans, or do I have too many basils because I want the bees to have food to eat? But is it ultimately because I want them to pollinate my food? So I think that I'm always asking those questions. And how do we imagine to not be human? I think there are a lot of very interesting scientific inquiries and research where they center trees that communicate with each other through their roots or fungus that's underground. So I think that that's one area that I think is very beautiful and very explosive. My own project, I think, is really to lure people into rethinking their aesthetics and politics through very grounded material. And I think that's always been the domain of artists, is to change practice, change imagination by noticing something that's always been there, but consider them differently. And I think that I will take your challenge to heart to see if I can move beyond the human.
Seems to me you are. I mean, I take the plants that you are working with as, in a sense, your interlocutors in this, right?
Yeah. I think I am, but I think that the main question that is most powerful to me is that how do I move us all beyond the human? And one thing I want to say, that one overlapping intersection between Nandita and my work is really about the solution. Instead of just kind of challenging paradigms, is by doing that, maybe we come up with very different solutions. And I think that to not center the human is a very central way of doing that.
Yeah, so your question, Radhika, about how some environmentalists also challenge national boundaries or borders alongside no borders movements that do the same, and how they may converge and diverge is a very interesting one. I find the way that the ones that I'm familiar with, in at least the environmental movement talking opposed to national borders, is the usual argument goes something like this, right? Like, current national boundaries are not natural boundaries, right? The corollary to that would be, oh, they're not natural ethnic boundaries, right? Migration scholars sometimes say, oh, these borders are ridiculous because they break up ethnic groups, right? And half the ethnic group is in one nation state, the other half is in another nation state. Of course, that's going to create conflict, right? So there's this kind of weird racialized system going on here. But environmentalists kind of do a similar thing, right? They're going, oh, these borders are not natural, right? A much more natural border would be to follow a mountain, a mountain line, or follow a river line, or so I would say that no borders are natural, right? We actually do have a common planet. So anytime a border is established, that is always a political, social, economic process, whether it's done in the name of the river valley, or it's done in the name of the quote unquote race, or it's done in the name of the nation. These are all borders that work to actually produce a particular kind of community, and always in opposition to the other community who lives elsewhere, right? So we have increasingly, since the late 18th century, arguably, an increasingly territorialized imagination, right? We imagine that everyone, when we're talking about humans, everything, when we're talking about non-humans, has its place in the world, right? And we've got the terms for it: autochthony, allochthony, right? This is an autochthonous rock. This is an allochthonous rock. We classify everything, like, where did it come from, right? Where does the dandelion originate? Where does the pig originate? Where does garlic come from? All of these kinds of questions. So a heavily territorialized imagination is kind of like weighing on our brains constantly. And arguably, in terms of what I was talking about, the international refugee system, the refugee system is actually evidence for the failure of the nation state system, right? So after World War II, former colonies and former imperial metropoles get turned into, quote unquote, independent nation states. And then they all agree to a refugee system, right? And the only reason they agree to a refugee system is actually acknowledging that the nation state system doesn't work, right? That the nation state system is not actually a quote unquote community, right? That within every nation state, there are going to be persecuted minorities, right? And therefore we have to figure out some mechanism by which to deal with them. And that's what the international refugee system is, right? Otherwise, if you're not part of this refugee system, you have no right to enter territories other than that of which you are a citizen of, right? So I think that this, in conjunction with this kind of territorialized imagination that we think of ourselves and our others through the political system, for instance, the refugee system, as well as the international nation state system of which it's a part, we are encouraged to imagine ourselves as national gardeners, right? We're tending the national soil. We're protecting the garden from invaders. And it is interesting that you say that refugees are often portrayed as abject, right? As victims, as suffering bodies that need our help, right? So it positions us as rescuers. They are the victims that we need to rescue. From whom? The nation state system. But increasingly, refugees are being moved into the feisty category, right? They're not really refugees. How many real refugees are there, right? Aren't they just looking for a better life? Aren't they just fleeing a drought in Honduras, right? Aren't they just, fleeing ocean rise? And they're kind of willfully crossing national borders without official permission, because official permission is very difficult to get. So they are being shifted into the category of the feisty, that, the only feisty people allowed are co-nationals, right? Or the things that belong. We are encouraged to be feisty. Everyone else should be a supplicant, right? So we imagine ourselves in that sense as national gardeners, always trying to eradicate the weeds.
So let me take up that idea that national gardening is a kind of a provocative image. And, on the one hand, it has all of the terrible things if you want to win a prize at the local, at the local show for your great national garden. But it does make me think of the fact that aside from attachment to nation, or attachment to nation is often correlated with a kind of attachment to land that is broader than just the nation, that has a relationship to troubled relationship to ideas of soil and landscape and so on. But there is also a kind of acknowledgement of those who have actually a very deep, intimate relationship with the plants, animals, and so on that they live with and have lived with for many, many years. And so that intimacy actually means that there is a very well-developed and well-developed experience and deep knowledge of what's going on there. In both of you, in your project of, in a way, uprooting this sense of settlement or this settlement around the state, how is it possible to produce a different, what Raymond Williams calls structure of feeling around this, when our relationships to, I do know that nations themselves have had recent enough origin that I can imagine how you can rethink a history, although it's extraordinarily powerful. But the attachment to place, for lack of a better term, and the enormous affective response that it evokes from many of us, you know, the trees, the temperature, the climate, all of which is changing, but nevertheless, all of those things that are part of a sensory response. How does one actually shake that up, or is that even part of the project? How does one shift the structure of feeling that seems to map on the nation onto land or territory?
And you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that I'll start with, you know, making a distinction between land and territory. These are two very, very different things. But often when people talk about land and their attachment to place, they are in fact talking about territory, right? They're talking about their attachment not to the actual land, because very few of us actually are able to live on the land, and I'm including air and water here. Very few of us on the planet are able to live on the land as our means of sustenance, right? Most of us have been alienated from land and air and water because it is no longer the source of sustenance for us. Most of us on the planet need paid labor for our sustenance, right? So we have been, you know, incredibly alienated from the land that we actually live on, which has, you know, no small part to play of the climate catastrophe, right? Because, you know, for instance, as the Chipko movement in India, in northern India, demonstrated that people whose attachment to land is the basis of their livelihoods, is the basis of their sustenance, they have a very, very strong and powerful attachment to that land and the need to ensure its continued viability as the source of life, right? People who don't have that relationship to land are much more likely to dump toxins into the river or the ocean, chop down the trees, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that there has been an ideological shift along with this development of capitalism that has taken us off the land, more and more people off the land and into the workplace as their source of sustenance. There's been an ideological shift from our ideas of country to country, right? Like, you know, the kind of, you know, the original meaning of like my country was actually the land and the air and the water and all of those other living beings that sustained my life and the life of the community. And then it shifted into country, right? So that my country is now India, or it's Canada, or it's the United States. Like that makes no sense, right? In any way other than in a very abstracted sense of territorial sovereignty and national citizenship, right? So the larger question of how do we shift it back from country to country is the urgent question of our times, right? And one of the ways that we do it is that Gaye and I have tried to do it is through eating in public by demonstrating actually that two things that maybe I'll let Gaye talk about if you don't mind me directing you into this, Gaye, is actually creating systems social economic systems that are demonstrably sustaining, right? Life sustaining of the person who is utilizing them. And then secondly, how none of these systems would survive if it was not for the stranger, right? So getting us out of this idea that the stranger is always to be feared to actually, without the stranger, we're going to die, right? To put it in dramatic terms.
So of course, I'm going to take it to it from a different vantage point. So I think that knowledge is produced primarily by prolonged and careful observation. Like people all over the globe and animals, I am sure, is that we learn by just seeing when the leaves turn brown, and then like, oh, I see, this is the fourth time it's done it, so this is when it happens. So I think that knowledge production is always through observation, and I think communicating to other people. I think so. The attachment to place is because if I move to a different house, I have to learn all over again what grows where. So I can completely understand the attachment from a very pragmatic survival perspective. I think the problem is when this attachment or this feeling of melancholia and loss, because of colonialism or expropriation and all kinds of horrors, that we try to attach grieving to something outside of the actual loss of our survival strategies and the land to survive. So I think that the work that Eating in Public tries to do is we can't give people land, obviously, but to reconnect with observation and grounded practice, and then see what happens. And then so just like kind of jumping off what Nandita is saying about the stranger, that the free plant stores have a whole ecology about the participants. So some people who can't bear throwing away their old yogurt pots will bring them to the free store. And then some other person will take them all, make holes in them, take the seeds in the seed sharing station, grow the seeds into seedlings, and then bring them back into the free store. So I think this is a kind of miraculous happening that I did not plan. And so they're kind of like a human bee in the sense that they transform material and then contribute, but with no, like not really asking for anything in return, except that this person likes to do that. Like that's their purpose that they've decided to. So I think that there are things that our systems create a space for activities and imaginings that we don't pre-plan. Like most of my other artwork, I want the installation to be like this. This project is to open up space for those opportunities. And I think that in terms of the No Borders movement, is to allow the no border imaginings for the human bees to have a place to be that bee.
Can I just follow up on that? And both of you brought up eating in public and you talked about it, and I'm just going to maybe ask a last question before we open to the audience, which is actually, something I've been thinking about for a while, which is how you landed on what is a really powerful metaphor in eating in public. Like many of the ways in which we think about future imagining are making and constructing, these are the kinds of ways in which we often speak about that. And you, on the other hand, have arrived at eating, which is a kind of incorporation, and is obviously you're thinking about eating and incorporation, reincorporation, while being situated in a profound critique of the nation state, right? Which incorporates and reincorporates and spits out and excludes and excretes and so on in ways that are very troubling. How did you arrive at that? Or is that just a natural outcome of thinking of this? Or am I grafting onto this? Because it just strikes me as an unexpected, like it's not sowing, farming, or even gardening, as you said, it's eating.
It was total thoughtlessness. It was an accident. It wasn't even a
Brilliant
project.
accident.
It was a very lucky and brilliant accident, because we started this project just because we had too many papaya seedlings and decided to plant them someplace outside of our, what we had control over. And then I'm not sure how Nandita came up with this. I don't know why we even thought we needed to call it something, because this wasn't a project. So yeah, what luck. Because I agree, I quite like it because it's still kind of not quite attached to anything specifically. Nandita, do you remember?
I kind of remember because this is related back to the Diggers, who we also relate to as our identity in this project. And so the Diggers of the 17th century in the English countryside were people who were being whose lands were being expropriated, whose commons were being expropriated, and who very well understood that without their ability to access the commons, that they would starve, right? So their signature act of resistance to their expropriation and displacement was to plant edible crops. And they did so both to make this larger political statement that eating in public does, but also that kind of more prosaic, like we need to eat, right? Like no one else is going to feed us unless we plant these crops on this land. And they were, these diggers of the 17th century were simultaneously dismissed by the powerful, by the rulers, as ridiculous. What, they're planting beans is their resistance? Like, where's their army, right? How are they going to overthrow us by planting beans? But they also understood them as the greatest threat, right? Because they were literally demonstrating that the only way we would continue to be free was to be able to use the land in order to sustain life. So I think we were thinking about the politics of eating and how eating in public is also like this tiny little project, planting papaya seedlings, et cetera, but also fundamentally challenging the existing order.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I see there's some questions coming in, so if I can maybe start relaying some of those to you. There's one from Zoya Mohsin, which says, "Thank you for the great talks. I was wondering what is the role of language, that is the we, the refugee, the nation, etc., in perpetuating binaries and violence? And a subset of that is it important to change the language, or how could we focus on reshaping the material reality in these different contexts?"
Yeah, I think that it is super important to change the language, which is, why I'm always like throwing around scare quotes, because certainly the refugee is a state category, right? Just like the Canadian is a state category. I think that it is profoundly important that we no longer identify ourselves through state categories and really understand that all of us actually move as a part of our being, right? Why some people are solely categorized by their mobility, right? Migrants, while other people are solely categorized by their supposed attachment to place, right? The national citizen. Really, that binary really needs to be challenged, right? And just acknowledging how, if we are not personally moving, who is moving in order so that we can live, right? Not only are the commodities moving, but the people who are, growing our food are moving, right? So we live in a world in which mobility is super and is an integral part of our ability to live, but we still see it as aberrant, right? We still see it as something's wrong with something if people have to move, right? Things. So I think that, yeah, we definitely do need new language, and the relationship between how we think, how we identify, and how the structures are organized is a very, very deep one, right? As many philosophers have pointed out to us. So how we think of ourselves and others really does matter in very, very important ways.
The virus has been a good example of something that moves and has been participant in ideas of contagion that are very troubling, right? Sorry, Gaye, you were.
Just an obvious answer that I think that language of it freezes meaning. And I think especially when it's taken up by political movements, and just coming from a queer perspective is to queer words, to return them to multiple meanings. And I really like what Nandita was saying, that demonstration versus demonstration, or both two meanings of demonstration. So I'm doing a basket making demonstration on Sunday, and I just realized, oh my God, I could just frame it as a political demonstration instead of like a skill sharing. So I think that with that, it completely opens up a new thread for eating in public of like demonstration to reclaim that word.
Yes.
From a crafter perspective. And then to challenge also like the kind of street protest demonstration model. And
Indeed.
Wabi wants to say hello.
Hello, Wabi. There's a question from Amanda. This is a question often asked of climate scholars and those who pose a problem. But are there political processes that you're observing today that align with your values of debordering? So are there processes that you see that are, I guess, connected to your notions of no borders?
And then you talk about the woman on the Aegean Sea.
Oh, you want me to talk about it? Okay, so yeah. Gaye and I were in Greece the same time that right after our trip, Radhika, to Lesbos, where we went to a conference together. What year was that? 2018, 2019?
Yes, it's in the before times, so time is a little
before times. And Gaye and I were in Athens for a feminist no borders summer school, free, of course. And we after the feminist no borders free summer school, we were going with friends from Athens to Thessaloniki to visit a soap factory that had been taken over by the workers during the austerity times in Greece. And so we were driving from Athens north to Thessaloniki in Greece. And as we were leaving Athens, all of these fire trucks were moving in the opposite direction towards Athens. And we were listening to the news, and the fires were raging around Athens. And there was a beautiful story on the news, right? Because this is in the midst of the so-called refugee crisis in Greece, right? Where massive concentration camps, i.e. refugee camps, had been built by the both Greek and international bodies. This older woman who's living in this little village close to Athens that is now on fire, who was forced to flee for her life into the sea, right? She had to go into as deep into the sea as she could in order to flee the fires that were just, pushing onto the shoreline. And she said, I just realized that in 15 seconds, anyone could become a refugee, right? So it's just that awareness that I don't have anywhere to live anymore. I can't live here anymore. I need to flee. Who's going to help me, right? And what was interesting is that the people who fled into the sea in all of these villages surrounding Athens were people who are known as the Egyptian fishermen, right? And I was like, what? Like fisher people from Egypt came to rescue people in the Aegean. Like what? But it was actually people who were called the Egyptian fishermen because they had, in a previous flight system, had to flee and were now living in Greece and working as fishers. And they are the ones who came and pulled up all of these Greek citizens out of the Aegean Sea and rescued them, right? So it was this perfect kind of opportunity to see that none of these categories make any sense, right? Egyptians, Greeks, and all that really makes sense is what are we going to do for one another, right?
So, but there's another part of this story, Nandi.
Yeah.
Because in Athens, because of the financial crisis, a lot of the big corporations and companies just, went bankrupt. And there was a hotel, I think it was like maybe 12 or 14 stories. I don't know how many hundreds of rooms they had. And because the workers couldn't get paid, they took over the hotel and they made it into a refugee hotel to house the refugees. And it's completely, they run it themselves. There are some NGOs who contribute money, but the refugee hotels held, I think, 200 to 400 refugees at a time. But when the fire happened, the Greek people who became refugees stayed at the hotel too. So, while there's a hostility, like why should we spend any money on refugees? Because in 15 seconds, anybody can become a refugee. So I think that this is a very dramatic example of my earlier yogurt container, right? That here's materiality, this is what's going on. Let's try and figure out a flow that serves everyone, regardless of like whether it be mitigation or kind of disrupting static imaginations.
Mm-hmm. Simon has a question. We've been speaking quite a lot about migration and displacement and so forth. I wondered, do you have rituals that you take very seriously that are climate-centered domestically in your own homes?
I'm not, Gaye and I are really kind of not very ritualistic people, in part because we're also very not sentimental. I think that's why we're so compatible in certain senses, but certainly we do certain things around the home in awareness of our contribution to climate catastrophe. But again, it's important, but it is grossly insufficient. Like, so for example, we could call this a ritual. Sometimes when we go for our evening walks, or whenever, there's a little beach by our house, and every day plastic comes up on the beach, right? Usually in like minuscule little forms, like there'll be big chunks of plastic in it, but usually little micro dots of blues and pinks and white plastics. And we ritually pick them up and we dump them in the garbage. Of course, that's just going to go to the landfill. And then we come back the next day and do it again, right? And that practice has really led us to go, what the fuck, right? Like, why are we picking up the plastic? Like, why is plastic being produced? Like, who's doing this, right? Like, instead of blaming not only the consumer of plastics, but the producers of plastics, like, why is this allowed to happen? Like, how many more days, this can go on endlessly. There'll always be plastic for us to pick up until the plastic stops being made, right? So I don't know if that's a good answer, but
I want to tackle this. I think that rituals are also dangerous. I'd rather think of it as practice or habits, whether it be picking up garbage or that I must shred the paper before I put them in the composter because the worms can eat them faster. It's more kind of grounded logistical habits rather than ritual. I think that ritual, like language or like borders can very easily create attachments to that rather than why you started them in the first place. So there was a second half of it that I forget, but I will come back to it if I remember. So, but I just want to acknowledge it's very dangerous when we transform practice to rituals. Oh, I remember now. Okay, so I do a different project of called Carrying Capacity, where I salvage shipping or bailing straps that tie commodities to pallets, and I weave them into baskets. So I do demonstrations. Do you hear the Sharma?
Yes.
Whistling very loud.
Drama thrush.
Yeah. So anyway, so I am not a basket maker. I am not necessarily interested in salvaging these straps. I just can't stand the fact that they are going into the waste stream. But then now that I've been doing it for 9 years and made over 1,000 baskets because I can't stop, people are like, oh, here I am giving you more straps. I'm like, no, it's not, I'm not that, I'm just trying to solve a problem. So I think that it would be dangerous for me to take up the identity that I'm a basket maker, because they will perpetuate actually the problem I'm trying to make go away. I want the straps to stop. I don't want any more straps. Mm-hmm. And I think rituals often continue the straps.
I think we're reaching a close, and that's actually a nice place to close, because I think one of the things your work is sort of pushing against also is a kind of resistance to kind of grand or monumental. It has grand ambitions, but not monumental in its practice, right? Not monumental in the way in which it approaches it, which seems to me appropriate in the fact that it's about reincorporating oneself differently, or finding a different way to incorporate or reincorporate. So with that, I want to thank both of you, Nandita and Gaye, for a very stimulating afternoon, early morning for you, and probably night for others who are joining us. And also to thank the Cooper Climate Coalition for putting this afternoon together and for bringing us together in conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Radhika.
Yeah, thanks, Radhika. That was a great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you again to our guests, Nandita Sharma, Gaye Chen, and Radhika Subramaniam, for being with us today. Tomorrow, we'll have an architecture discussion called Deconstruction and Reconstruction with Billy Fleming and Doris Sung, moderated by Cooper's own Austin Wade Smith. That'll be at 12 p.m. Eastern Time here on YouTube. A recording of this discussion will be available on our YouTube channel and at our website at climate.cooper.edu. I want to thank all of you for such an amazing conversation. We really appreciate it. Take care, everybody. Have